Butowsky has appeared before this group on a number of occasions. He was, up until most recently, historian at the National Park Service Washington office. But back before that, he's now retired, but before that, since about 81, he's been an adjunct professor at George Mason. And in 78, he's been an adjunct at Northern Virginia Community College, mostly at the Loudoun and Manassas campuses, but sometimes they have a special course out in Reston. After he retired, he was able to teach courses during the day, and George Mason asked him to teach a course called World Civilization in one term. And it's taught usually Western Civ 101 and 102. So he was teaching world history, and you know, India got like 5 minutes.
Actually 2.5 minutes.
It is ridiculous. But anyway, he has taught a number of times World War I, you know, war in the Pacific and then the war in Europe, and then he taught World War I. Just as a little background from my personal opinion about things, very few people know anything at all about World War I, and as far as its effect on us today, and Harry is going to point that out, just two things as a reminder. The whole Middle East was a very important theater in World War I, and it was handled very badly, both militarily and then, of course, after the war. If you saw Lawrence of Arabia, it's pretty clear what happened. The British and the French and so forth, they screwed everything up, and we're paying for it today. Another thing that happened is the islands in the Pacific, many of them, particularly the Marianas, where I was from World War II, the Marianas were the property of the German government. And the Japanese were on our side in World War I. And when the war ended, the Marianas, along with a few other islands, were given to the Japanese. And of course we owned Guam at the time, but then when the Japanese swept in, they took Guam like that. And so we then ended up with a place called Saipan and Tinian, which was occupied by the Germans, which was by the Japanese, which they got from being on our side during World War I. So there's a number of important political things that happened during World War I. It was a very complex war, and as you'll find out, and you probably already know, that the rise of Hitler and his crowd had a lot to do with what went wrong at the end of World War I, and how the politicians, as usual, screwed everything up. So let me let you start with Harry Butowsky, our historian. Harry?
Well, thank you very much. Now you will excuse me, I'm going to sit for part of this presentation up here, and then I'll stand when I do my slideshow presentation. The reason I like to sit is, since I was here last time, I've had 2 knee operations. Yes. Oh, since I was here last time, I had 2 knee operations, 2 hernia operations, and since I thought I was having operations, I decided I had 2 cataract operations. A couple words of advice. You ever go to see your doctor about a sore knee, and he says, you know, I think you need a replacement. What you do is you don't walk out of his office, you run out of the office as fast as you can go. The second thing is, getting old is not easy. I seem to be spending all my time in the doctor's. It's a good thing I retired. I mean, I'm busier today than I ever was, like every week. 1 or 2 doctors, and taking my wife to 1 or 2 doctors. So that's neither here nor there. But my knee is fine. You can see me limping well. What the heck? I'm limping. Now, usually, I've been teaching World War I for 20 years. Usually when I teach the World War II class, I ask the class, number 1, are there any World War II vets? Because I've been teaching that for almost 25 years. Sometimes a hand will go up. Sometimes my students think I'm a World War II vet. And I said, well, no, I was alive during World War II, but I was a little young to be drafted. So far, none of my students have asked me if I'm a World War I vet. But World War I is 100 years ago, but then again, it's not that far along. I'm sure everyone in this class knows a World War I vet, or remembers a World War I vet. I know in my family, had World War I vets in their family. How many people have had World War I vets in their family and do World War I vets? Sure. There are a lot of Americans that served in that war, as well as a lot of Europeans who served in that war. So we all know World War I vets. And actually the last American World War I vet died in 2012. That was Frank J. Buckles. He died in the spring of 2012, was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. So it's a long way, it's 100 years ago, but then again, it's not 100 years ago. Now, just for further information, when I teach my World War I class, I have 4 books that I have to read. Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August. If you're looking for one book to read on World War I would recommend Barbara Tuchman. A superb historian, she published this in 1962. Pulitzer Prize winning book, it's been in print ever since that time. I recommend Alistair Horn, The Price of Glory, done in 1916. Just about Verdun, what it was like when they fed you into that wall. The troops going up to Verdun on the French side, they went up a road called the Sacred Way, and you could see Verdun at night. It was like a furnace with fire on the horizon, and you were being poured into that fire. And Germany and France, that's what Germany and France did for 9 months in 1916. They poured main material, they poured the entire accumulated wealth of their societies that accumulated for a previous 150 years in that fire. They managed to kill and wound about 800,000 men. What did they do it for? Nothing. What had changed? Nothing. That's the insanity of the war. Now, you can't talk about World War I, and we're talking about the Russian Revolution. And the book that I recommend on the Russian Revolution is a book by John Reed. John Reed was actually American, and he wrote a contemporary history of the Russian Revolution. He was over there, and he wrote a detailed history. Now, he's virtually the only one. Leon Trotsky wrote a history of the Russian Revolution, but no one else. Lenin, Stalin, Bukharin, Kamenev, Zinoviev, nobody wrote a history of the Russian Revolution that participated in it from the Bolshevik side. Why? Because Stalin killed them all in the 1930s. So they never got around to writing their memoirs. Incidentally, in terms of writing memoirs, one of the first memoirs that came out on the war was a memoir by General Erich Ludendorff, who was commander of all the German armed forces from 1916 to 1918, and he was really the driving force in German military and foreign policy during that period of time. Ludendorff resigns his position in October 1918 when he sees how the war is going and his health breaks. By June of 1919, he's publishing his 2-volume history of the First World War. How he had over time to do that, I don't know. He actually publishes his volume just 3 weeks after the Versailles Conference is completed and everybody signs. But Ludendorff was the first to get out his history. Then another book I recommend, and many of you know this and probably read it, Maria Remarque, called Quiet on the Western Front, and talks about a young man by the name of Paul Ballard who enlists in the Army, very idealistic. We're going to fight for Germany, we're going to die for Germany, and then he gets exposed to the reality of the war. And he realizes he's been lied to by his teachers, by the elders of the society, by the government. He sees the true horror and meaninglessness of the war. So these are some books that I would recommend to you. Now let me just give you a few of Barbara Tuchman. Yes?
What was Reed's book title? I mean, it was nice of you to think that we could read it back here because it's so big, but I can't.
It's called 10 Days That Shook the World. John Reed. You can look on the internet, on Amazon for John Reed, you'll find only one book. Why? He died right after he wrote it.
What was Tuchman's name?
Barbara. I'll leave these books up here. Barbara W. Tuchman.
What's the name of the
The
book?
Guns of August.
Oh, Guns of August. Okay.
The Guns of August. Now, she's written about 8 or 10 books. Very fine historian. All right. I'll leave them up here and you can come up and take a look at it. And everybody's familiar with Remarque, right? Yeah. Remarque actually served in the war as a young man, and this is semi-autobiographical.
Oh, yay.
Ah, good. Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Usually I don't don't have this problem. But let me just read you the opening lines of Tuckman. She's describing the funeral of Edward VII in May 1910, which is the last grand event of royalty in the 19th century. And everybody was there. The English were there, the French, the Kaiser was there, the Russians were there. And this is what she says. So gorgeous was the spectacle on the May morning of 1910 when 9 kings rode in the funeral of Edward VII of England that the crowd, waiting and hushed and black-clad all, could not keep back gasps of admiration. And scarlet and blue and green and purple, 3 by 3, the sovereigns rode through the palace gates, plumed with helmets, gold braid, crimson sashes, and jeweled orders flashing in the sun. After them came 5 heirs apparent, 40 more imperial royal highnesses, 7 queens, 4 dowagers, and 3 regnant, and a scattering of special ambassadors from uncrowned countries. Together they represented 70 nations, and the greatest assemblage of royalty and rank that had ever been gathered in one place, and of its kind the last. The muffled tongue of Big Ben told 9 by the clock as the cortege left the palace, but on history's clock it was sunset. The sun of the old world was setting in a dying blaze of splendor, never to be seen again. Isn't that beautiful language? I always tell my students, if you want to be a good historian, you have to know how to write. Take English. Read a lot of literature and learn how to write. But good historians like Barbara Tuckman, when they write, they're painting word pictures. So when you write and you paint a word picture, that's when history becomes meaningful to you. All right, I'm going to leave these books up here. Now, let me say something about the war. It's called the First World War, right? No, it's not the First World War. It's the Great War. And that's the title it was given at the time, and that's the title. Is it still working? And that's the title it has, in my mind, today. Because the First World War was a cataclysmic event. It marks the divide between the 19th and the 20th century. The world of 1914 and the world of 1919 were totally different. Absolutely. In every way you can think about. It's not just the scale of the war. The war took place not only in Europe, it took place in the Middle East, it took place in Africa. There were actions on the high seas at Jutland, in the North Sea, in the South Atlantic, in India, in the Indian Ocean. But it has to do with the change of society, with the change in political institutions, the disappearance of governments, the way people perceive themselves and the world. And the First World War also gave us a lot of movements which we probably could have done without in the 20th century. First World War gave us communism. Boy, that was a really good thing to have. The Bolsheviks will come to power in 1918, and they will remain in power in Russia until 1989, 1990. The First World War gave us fascism. Just think of what the world would have been like if you didn't have Adolf Hitler in power, or Mussolini in power, but especially Adolf Hitler. The First World War was the beginning of the decolonization of the British and French empires. Now, it's not apparent at first. In fact, the empires expand, but the seeds for decolonization have already been sown. There were 1.5 million from India who served in the British Army. Probably almost 1 million men from Australia and New Zealand and Canada. And after they came back from the war, let's just say their opinion of England, the British government and British leadership was not what you would want to be. First World War also saw the rise of America as a great power. Now, America is a great power. America demonstrates its power in 1898 in the war against Spain, but, Spain was the third great power by that time. But in 1917, 1918, America brings the full muscle of its economic power to bear in Europe. For America, the war lasts only 18 months, but by the spring of 1918, we're landing 250,000 men a month on the continent. We're flooding the continent with all sorts of hardware and all sorts of food. America's just gearing up. The First World War also marks the decline of Europe in every way you can imagine. Europe was really the center of the world in 1914. England, France, Germany, Russia dominated the world. They dominated world politics. They dominated the world economy. Europe by 1919 is bankrupt, both economically and physically bankrupt. First World War gave us the first genocide in modern history, the genocide of the Turks of the Armenians in 1915. Now, we don't know how many Armenians died. Some say 500,000, some say 1 million. The number's in dispute. And to this day, the Turks deny it was genocide. To this day, the Turks maintain it was simply poor planning. They uprooted the Armenians. They took them out of their homes. They said they were disloyal. They were agents of the Russians, and they marched them to Syria and to other areas in the Middle East. They made no provisions for them at all, but hundreds of thousands died. Is it genocide? Is it not genocide? My own opinion is it was genocide. The First World War was also the genesis of all the problems we have in the Middle East today. Well, maybe not all, but many. There was no Syria, there was no Lebanon, there was no Iraq, there was no Palestine or Israel, there was no Saudi Arabia. All these entities were created after the First World War. What the European statesmen did was they divided up the Ottoman Empire into spheres of influence. For example, Kuwait. When they were creating these nation states after 1919, Kuwait should have been part of Iraq. It has historically been associated with the Shia portion of Iraq. Well, that was cut out and made a separate kingdom by the British because they knew Kuwait had the oil and they wanted to dominate the small country for its oil. In a sense, when Saddam Hussein moves into Iraq in 1990, he says he's reclaiming the 19th province of Iraq. He was telling the truth, but we didn't know our history. So they divided up the Middle East, and if you ever looked at a map of the Middle East, what do you notice? All the lines are straight. How do countries get straight lines? There aren't straight lines in Europe. They have straight lines because Wilson, Clemenceau, and the people who worked on that map used a ruler, and they divided them up. Did Wilson know what a Shia was, what a Kurd was? Wilson know who the Sunnis were and how they got along together? No. They just carved up states according to their own belief, and they put all these people together. Now, the Middle East was sort of a quiet place while the Turks were there. The Turks knew you didn't put the Sunnis, the Shias, and the Kurds together. They kept them separate, their own separate entities, as long as you, gave obedience to the ruler of Turkey in Istanbul. But no, the Europeans carved it up and they imposed this facade of the nation state on the Middle East. The nation state is a concept that's absolutely alien to the Middle East. In the Middle East, the political concept was the caliphate, and Turkey was, the Turkish Empire was the caliphate. All those Muslim lands were part of the caliphate, and we imposed this concept of the nation state. And not only that, we mixed all the populations up, and we're still working out those problems. They broke up the Austrian Empire and they created new states in the Balkans. Now, the Serbs, the Hungarians, the Romanians, maybe there was nothing they could do, but those guys didn't get along. And you notice that 20 years ago, after the death of Tito, Serbia just disintegrated. And you had a civil war and I would say genocide in Serbia, where a couple 100,000 Bosnians were killed, Bosnian Muslims were killed by the Serbians. So all these factors date back to the First World War. Now, a lot of people want to know why we had the First World War. Well, you can take it back to Germany. If there's one nation that's responsible, it's Germany. And What I mean by that is the creation of the German Empire in 1871. There had been no united Germany for 1,000 years. There had been the Holy Roman Empire or the Confederation of the Rhine. But in 1871, Germany becomes a unified state under Bismarck. The unified state is created in war, in 3 successful wars against Denmark in 1864, against Austria in 1866, and against France in 1870. Now, it's a federated empire. It's made up of Prussia and about 30 other small princely states. And it's not a unified state. The Kaiser, who is the leader of the empire, the Kaiser means king. He's king of Prussia, but he's also the German emperor, emperor of the other states. And when Germany goes to war, each state has its own separate army. For example, in 1914, Adolf Hitler never actually serves in the German army. He's in the Bavarian army. And the Bavarians and the Prussians don't like each other. You have the Saxon army, the Bavarian army, the army of Hanover. So you have all these separate armies under the leadership of the Prussians. Although not always. The man who commanded the German army in the south, in Alsace-Lorraine, was a man called Prince Ruprecht, heir to the throne of Bavaria, which is very interesting, showing you how intertwined these monastic dynasties were. Prince Ruprecht was the Stuart pretender to the throne of England. Some would say he should have been the rightful king of England, but he's heir to the throne of Bavaria. But what happened was when Bismarck, known as the Iron Chancellor, when he creates Germany, he creates a powerful new political, economic, and military state in the center of Europe. This has a disruptive effect. This threatens France, obviously because Germany has fought a war against France, taken Alsace-Lorraine. It's threatened Russia, and Germany. Russia's the Germans have been historically at odds for hundreds of years. And it threatens Austria. Germany had fought a war against Austria in 1866, had defeated Austria. Now, Bismarck did 2 things. Number one, he was very smart. He knew that Germany, in his opinion, had reached its maximum territorial expansion. And he doesn't want to expand it anymore beyond the borders of 1871. He knows to do this will upset the balance of power in Europe, even more so than it's upset at the present time. So he creates a system of alliances. He allies with Austria. This is the dual alliance. He has an alliance between Austria, Germany, and Russia called the Dreikaiserbund, the Three Emperors League. He has an alliance between Austria and Italy and Germany called the Triple Alliance. Now, after the young Kaiser comes to the throne, and even while the old Kaiser was there, the old Kaiser actually had a question. And that question was, we're allied with Austria. If Austria goes to war, we have to support Austria. And we're also allied with Russia. If Russia goes to war, we have to support Russia. Yes. Well, what happens if Russia and Austria go to war? And Bismarck said, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. His aim was to have everybody tied to Germany, to make Berlin the fulcrum of not only the economic center of Europe, but the political center of Europe. And when the Balkans, flared up in the 1870s, he didn't allow a war to come between Austria and Russia. He called all those diplomats to Berlin, and he solved that problem. He laid out, what the settlement would be, and everybody accepted it. Bismarck did everything possible. His formula was, there are 5 nations in Europe. You want to make sure you're in alliance with 3 of them, and you're 3 against 2. The nation he could not ally with was France. Now, he made some overtures to France, but it was not possible because France was still feeling the defeat of 1870, 71, and the French, were still feeling the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. All right, so he creates this very supple and very flexible and very dynamic system for controlling the other nations. And he was the master. He was the guy who was conducting the orchestra. But in terms of domestic politics, this is where Bismarck falls down. Bismarck is a monarchist, He wants to keep the power of the King of Prussia. He wants to keep power in the hands of the nobility. Now, this is a period of time when the people of Europe are moving toward parliamentary government. There's a parliamentary government in England. It's not a democratic government. Women cannot vote, but it's moving in that direction. France is a parliamentary government. You have parliamentary governments in Spain and Portugal and Denmark and Sweden. So this concept of having a parliament and having responsibility be in the hands of the population who vote for their delegates is sweeping over Europe. So the Kaiser, Bismarck makes a concession. He gives the German people a parliament. It's called the Reichstag. Everybody can vote for the Reichstag. But in the final analysis, the Reichstag has very little power. Germany becomes a federated state, and the power is shared between Prussia and the other states. And in the other states, although they have their assemblies, the voting is also rigged. So power really remains in the hands of the elite, the aristocracy, and especially the aristocracy of Prussia, and especially the King of Prussia. Now this is going to work very well, as long as Bismarck is the Chancellor and the King of Prussia is William I, who listens to Bismarck. William I was a fine old gentleman. He was born in 1797. He was old enough to have fought in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and he had seen the political development, the military, economic development of Prussia. He had been in charge in 1866 and 1864, 1866, and in 1870-71. And he trusted the Kaiser. Now, William I had a son, Frederick. Frederick was married to the daughter of Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is the daughter of Victoria, excuse me. And his wife's name is also Victoria. Victoria was very much influenced by her mother, and she wanted Germany to evolve into the type of society that England was, where you had a parliament, and parliament had real power, and the monarch was merely a figurehead. Now this made Frederick very unpopular with his father, very unpopular with Bismarck, very unpopular with the ruling classes. So, Bismarck is watching this situation. Fortunately for Bismarck, however, when the old king dies in 1888, Frederick comes to the throne. Frederick has throat cancer. He lives 3 months, then he dies. And then the king's grandson comes to the throne, Kaiser Wilhelm II, otherwise known as Kaiser Bill. Now, Kaiser Bill was born in 1859. He's the first grandchild of Victoria. Now, the birth was very difficult, and the doctors were really more worried about his mother than they were about the future king of Prussia. And the doctors used forceps to pull the Kaiser out of the birth canal there. When they did so, they dislocated his left arm. So for the rest of his life, he is hampered by a withered left arm. And he cannot cut his food. He has a hard time riding his horse. This is going to cause psychological problems. Also, the Kaiser hates his mother. Now, I don't want to get into the psychology of this, but he hates his mother and he hates his father. To say they didn't get along would be a vast understatement. Perhaps because when he was young, they gave him all sorts of medical treatments that they hoped would heal his arm. Didn't heal his arm, but they had a big effect on the Kaiser. They gave him a very strict tutor who would whack him around if he didn't learn his lessons very well. So the Kaiser's got some severe psychological problems. So anyway, the man who becomes the Kaiser is now determined to rule in his own right. He's not going to listen to Bismarck. Bismarck's an old fuddy-duddy. So what does he do? He fires Bismarck and he appoints another chancellor, Caprivi. The problem is the Kaiser doesn't understand the situation. He doesn't understand the need to keep Russia, Austria, and Italy into an alliance. So he begins monkeying with the alliance system. And, Germany and Russia are now tied together with something called the Insurance Treaty, which is up for renewal in 1890. And the Kaiser says, we can't renew this because we have a treaty with Austria. I mean, it doesn't work. So he tells the Russians to go take a hike. Well, the Russians take a hike. They took a hike straight to Paris. And, the French are very glad to have the Russians. Now, the Kaiser never thought that the French Republic, which is the home of this is the place to cut off the head of Louis XVI of France, would come into an agreement with Russia, but that's exactly what happens. In 1892, you have a Franco-Russian alliance. Now, this is a nightmare for Germany, because that means that any war with Russia or France, it's going to be a war on two fronts. Absolutely a nightmare. Greatest mistake the Kaiser ever had. One of his famous statements was, upon becoming king, was, a new generation of Germans has come to the throne, full speed ahead. Of course, what he doesn't tell the steersman, the guy driving the ship, is which direction to go. But it was going to be full speed ahead. So he creates problems, and he threatens the other nations of Europe. For example, England and Germany got along very well together. The Kaiser, after all, is the grandson of Victoria. He loves his mother, and he loves his visits to his mother's summer home on the Isle of Wight. He loves his visits to the British fleet. So what does the Kaiser do? During the Boer War, he supports the Boers. The British are fighting in South Africa. Makes a lot of uncomplimentary statements about the British. Then he decides he's going to build a high seas fleet. Why do you need a high seas fleet? You know, Bismarck said we don't need a fleet. We're a land power. But he builds a high seas fleet, and especially in 1904, when you have a new type of ship coming called the Dreadnought, England and Germany are in a rush. Now, as far as the English are concerned, this is a threat to England. England needs that fleet, that they need to protect themselves. The Germans don't need a fleet, so he alienates the English. So what you see evolving is an alliance system. Germany is tied to Austria, and weakly to Italy in the Triple Alliance, and then you have a triple entente between Germany, Russia, and England. England is not formally a member of the Triple Entente, but virtually a member of the Triple Entente. The other thing you need to know is, the other thing you need to know is that Italy, by 1910, is beginning to think it's betting on the wrong horse. Italy allied with Prussia and Austria in the 1880s because that looked like the important state. But by 1910, the Italians are not necessarily allied with them, although they don't formally become non-allies. What they do is they make overtures to the British and the French. So what you have is a system that starts out with Germany, allied with Austria, Italy, and Russia, neutral England opposed to France, Germany allied just with Austria, and Russia, England, France are the enemies, and Italy become the enemy. All right, now this is a map of Europe in 1914. Notice it looks somewhat different. You have Germany, which extends to East Prussia, east of the Elbe. You have a large Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, of all these states, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was sweetest. About 45, 50 million people, was made up of various nationalities. Those nationalities consist of Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, Ruthenians, and they didn't get along together. They all wanted their own state. This is a great age of nationalism, so this is a rickety empire. Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, is also in the last stage of disintegration, and even the Russians aren't in such great shape. All right. What we're going to do now is I'm going to move into a slideshow. Start squealing, we'll get feedback. All right, got to maneuver. We're going to do a lot of maneuvering in this class. World War I, the famous statesman by Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Minister, on hearing of the British declaration of war against Germany, the lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. And that was more true than anyone could realize. 1914. Key date is June 28th. The heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, Ferdinand, visits Sarajevo with his wife Sophie. They're assassinated by this man, Princeps, who was a Serbian nationalist. Now, Ferdinand had been warned not to visit Sarajevo on June 28th. That was the anniversary of a great battle that the Serbs had fought against the Turks and had lost. And it was a very sensitive day to visit Sarajevo. Sarajevo's in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's part of the Austrian Empire, but the Serbs are very angry over this. They believe it should be part of Serbia. The Serbian ambassador actually warned Franz Ferdinand. He said, don't visit Sarajevo on June 28th. It ain't safe. And Franz Ferdinand supposedly said, no problem at all, they love me.
Not all of them.
Yeah, sure, they loved me. They loved me. They loved them enough, so they sent about a dozen guys there. Princeps was one of them to ambush Ferdinand. Now, Ferdinand wasn't very much for security. His trip was published in the paper. The paper said where he was going to go, where he was going to be. And he's riding around in the streets of Sarajevo in an open car. And while he's coming into City Hall, somebody threw a bomb in his car. The bomb hit the steering wheel, the bomb bounces off and explodes. It doesn't hurt him, it hurts the guys in the next car. So the car drives on. Gets to City Hall, the Lord Mayor says, welcome, welcome, welcome. And he says, what do you mean, welcome? Somebody threw a bomb at my car. What's going on here? The Lord Mayor is flustered. So after a few minutes, first Franz Ferdinand is advised to get out of town fast. Now you think he would put the top up on the car and head straight for the train station? No. He keeps the top down and he says, let's go to the hospital. I want to visit the people in the last car who were hurt. And they take off down the narrow streets again. Now all the assassins have dispersed. They feel like they've blown their chance. But they don't tell the driver where they're going, and they get in the middle of Sarajevo, and the driver's informed that he's not going the right way. They're going to the hospital, not to the train station. There's some confusion. So the driver stops at an intersection trying to figure out which way to go. And it turns out at that intersection there's a coffee shop, and there is Princeps. Princeps can't believe his luck. He looks over and there's this big touring car with some important people there. So he asks the policeman, he says, who is that in the car? The policeman says, oh, that's the Archduke and Sophie. Princeps says, thank you. Pulls out his pistol, bang, bang. Two bullets. They're both dead. Now, this is the funeral of Ferdinand and Sophie in Vienna. Now, one thing you have to know about Ferdinand was that he didn't get along with his uncle, who was the ruler, Franz Joseph. He didn't get along with much of the aristocracy of Austria-Hungary. Ferdinand was a reformer. Ferdinand wanted to make the Austrian Empire more inclusive. He wanted to bring the Slavs in, not just the Turks, not just Hungarians and the Austrians. He wanted to bring the Slavs in. So the ruling class doesn't really like him that much. Yeah, Vienna goes into mourning, but they're not really sad. I think the general tenor of opinion in Vienna was, well, they don't approve of anyone killing the heir apparent to the throne, but if somebody from the royal line had to die, Ferdinand was the first choice. So nobody really misses Ferdinand. All right, here's the funeral. All right, now, Franz Joseph, he's the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. He's been on the throne since 1848. By 1914, he is 84 years old. He works hard, he's dedicated, but he is absolutely rigid. He will not accept any reform or any change. He is worried that the empire is brittle and it's going to fall apart. So the government in Vienna is very, how shall I say, stiff. It's not very flexible, not really willing to change, not up to date. It's not as competent as it should be. Franz Joseph also has a head of the army by the name of Conrad von Holzendorf, who has recommended war against Serbia about 14 times in the past 3 years. Now, Holzendorf is a very dangerous individual. If you have somebody who's incompetent and lazy, that's great. You can live with them. But if you have somebody who's incompetent and ambitious, that's a problem. And Holzendorf was incompetent and ambitious. All right, that's Austria-Hungary. Then you have the Kaiser. Kaiser had about 300 different uniforms. He changed his uniform 3 or 4 times a day. He loved wearing the uniform of a British admiral, incidentally. But this is the Kaiser. The Kaiser, you never knew who he was. One day he was the warlord. The next day he was leader of the working class. The next day he was leader of the industrialists. He changed his mind a lot. Now, this guy was really flexible. It was always said that if you wanted the Kaiser to do something, make sure you were the last person to get him to say him before the end of the day. And he would agree with you. Now, they're a very bellicose individual. He's very threatening, but when he sees the prospect of war is coming, he's scared, and he tries to stop it. Now we have Tsar Nicholas II, very unfortunate individual with his son. Tsar Nicholas II and the Kaiser are cousins. His son is a direct descendant, a great-grandson of Victoria. Victoria is carrying the gene hemophilia, and the Tsar's son has hemophilia, and this causes a lot of strain in the Tsar's family, and especially for his mother, who feels so guilty that she passed this disease on to her son. Now, Tsar Nicholas II represents the problem with hereditary monarchy. What do you do when you have a monarch who is incompetent, who doesn't want to be a monarch? Well, now, the Kaiser wanted to be a monarch, and I wouldn't say he was incompetent. Yes, he was somewhat unstable. But Tsar Nicholas II doesn't want to be a monarch. He's a family man. He's interested in other things. He doesn't want to rule Russia. He comes to the throne in 1894. He hasn't even been prepared for the throne because his father, Alexander III, said, I'm not going to tell him anything until he's 30. I'm going to let him have a good time until he's 30. The problem is they killed Alexander III in 1894, and Nicholas is only 28. So Nicholas comes to the throne with no preparation at all, absolutely no preparation at all. He goes through a searing experience in the war against Japan in 1903, 1904. There's a revolution in Russia in 1905, and he's holding on. He gets talked into creating a Russian parliament, a Duma, but his wife is opposed to it, and the Duma has no real power. Everyone knows that he's not a reformer. All right, so these are the principal characters. Now, here you see Europe in 1914. The way this is going to shape up, you will have Germany and Austria-Hungary will be the dual alliance. Bulgaria will come in on the side of Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire will come in on the side of the Central Powers. Central Powers will be opposed by first France and then Russia. England will come in because of the violation of Belgian neutrality. Then Italy will come in, and then eventually, right from the beginning, Serbia and Romania will come in, and Greece will come in. All right, so this is the lineup of the nations as the war begins, although Italy doesn't come in until 1915. All right, July 28th, Austria declares war on Serbia. July 29th, Serbia's ally Russia mobilizes. Now this is a key event. As long as the war is between the minor powers, there have been two Balkan wars, or between Austria and Serbia, there's not going to be a world war. But if two major powers become involved, then that alliance system is like a tripwire, and it's going to start firing. And once it starts firing, you can't stop it, because the German war plan is predicated on the fact that once war is declared and the Russian army begins to mobilize, Germany has to mobilize, and Germany has to march into France. The German plan is called the Schlieffen Plan, and Schlieffen gave the Germans 40 to 45 days to knock the French out and then turn their army east. The theory was that the Russians would take a long time to mobilize, and you could deal with France in the intervening 3 or 4 weeks. Problem now is that Russia is mobilizing. War hasn't been declared, so the Germans have a problem. The Germans essentially go to the French and they say, what are you going to do? And they demand certain concessions from the French. The French won't give those concessions, so Germany is going to go to war against France. Before the declaration of war, however, the German chief of staff tells the Kaiser, and we're going to go to war against France. Now, this makes a lot of sense. Austria is going to war against Serbia, so we're going to attack Belgium so we can hit France. And the Kaiser says, now wait a minute then, why don't we just go to war against the Russians? And Monkey says, no, I'm sorry, we don't have that in our war plan. We're going to war against France. All right, so August the 1st, Germany, Austria's ally, declares war on Russia, bringing France into the war. August the 4th, the Germans invade Belgium and march on Paris. The Germans sent a note to the king of Belgium and say, let us march through Belgium and no problem, no damage, we'll restore Belgium after the war. The king said no, so the Germans had to fight their way through Belgium. They do fight their way through Belgium, but it takes them about 2 or 3 days. The great obstacle are the forts at Liège, and the Germans had planned for that. They brought big siege guns and they blew the forts to pieces. So they're not really substantially slowed down. Incidentally, the Germans knew all about the forts at Liège because number one, they built the forts, and number two, they supplied the artillery for the forts. So Great Britain declares war on Germany to protect Belgian neutrality. So nations now with 17 million soldiers are at war. That includes not only the nations in Europe, but their colonies. All right, now, as the war develops, Germany, with the Schlieffen Plan, moves through Belgium. The idea is you swing around behind Paris, and then you envelop the French army. Here's the French army here. The French have a war plan called Plan 17 under Joffre, and their war plan is to, their war plan is to strike into Germany, right here in the south, retake Alsace-Lorraine. So while the French are striking this way, the Germans are coming this way. The Germans couldn't have planned it any better if they won. But the Russians are mobilizing very quickly. They send two armies into East Prussia, one army under Rennenkampf to the north, one army under Sassenhoff to the south. Oh, each army has about 200,000 men. And they make a lot of progress. But there's a little fly in the ointment here. The fly in the ointment is Rennenkampf and Sassenhoff hate each other, and they don't communicate. They almost fought a duel before the war. So each one is essentially operating on his own. That and the fact that their codes were very easy to break when they were using codes at all. All right, so on August the 17th, the German army in East Prussia, which is makes up about 1/8 of the total German army, it meets the Russians in the Battle of Tannenberg and the Battle of the Masurian Lakes. The Russians are completely defeated. The Southern Army under Samsonov is trapped and is virtually annihilated. By September the 12th, the Germans have routed the Russians. The Russians lose 250,000 men. The German losses of 50,000. One of the aspects of this war, which nobody had really thought about, was the tremendous number of casualties. When these battles occur, we're not talking about 1,000, 2,000. We're talking about 10, 20, 50,000 casualties. On August 22nd, for example, the French will lose 28,000 men on one day. 28,000 men killed on one day. Largest loss of life in the French army for the entire war. While this is happening, the German army is in France, trying to carry out the Schlieffen Plan. All right, here's the Schlieffen Plan. September 5th through 9th, we have the first Battle of the Marne. The Germans should stop 40 miles outside of Paris and have to retreat back 50 miles. General Moltke, who is head of the army, is relieved, and he's replaced by Falkenhayn. Now, Moltke receives a lot of criticism because he lost control of the army. He wasn't with the army. He was back at the army headquarters in Aachen. Well, why is he in the army headquarters in Aachen? Because that's where the Kaiser was. And Moltke wanted to stay where the Kaiser was. You never knew what the Kaiser was going to do. You had to keep your eye on this guy. But he loses control of events. He has some very capable generals on the right wing. He has a man by the name of von Kluck and von Hausen, von Bülow, but they see the conflict differently. Also, Moltke has weakened the right wing of the German army. Von Kluck, for example, has about 325,000 men. That's the strong fist of the German army. But as he marches, he's dropping troops off to protect his flank. And then when the Russians invade East Prussia, he loses 50,000 men to support the Germans in East Prussia, which is unfortunate because they load on trains. By the time they get to East Prussia, they're no longer needed. By the time they get back to France, the battle has been lost. Now, Joffre is different. Joffre has a terrible war plan. And up north, he's got a good general by the name of Lanrezac, who's sending a message after message saying, I got more Germans up here than I can handle. I need reinforcements. And Joffre, says, don't worry about it, attack. Well, Lanrezac doesn't attack. He falls back, a fighting retreat. Finally, by the last few days in August, Joffre realizes what the problem is. What Joffre does is he begins to pull units out of the French army, which are engaged against the Germans, and begins to swing his army north. to counter that German threat. And they do counter that threat, and they managed to stop the Germans at the Battle of Marne. All right. Now, one of the things that made the First World War so deadly was they had new weapons. They had machine guns. The French, for example, believed in the power of the offensive, élan, courage, as the French like to say. And Foch and other French generals said the most important weapon a soldier has is a bayonet. And we'll line up shoulder to shoulder with our bayonets. And the sight of cold steel will so unhinge the Germans that they'll run away. Oh yes, just to make sure the Germans can see us, let's wear red pants and a blue top. Now the red pants and blue top date back to the Napoleonic Wars, and they served a function in that Napoleonic battlefields. There was a lot of smoke in the air, and you had hard time seeing who was who and who was friend and who was foe. They don't have that problem in 1914. What happens is they make good targets. So as the French come on shoulder to shoulder, the Germans line up their machine guns, and they just mow them all down. And, it's Cold Harbor, it's Petersburg, it's Gettysburg, Pickett's Charge all over again, except they now have machine guns, and they also have, rifles. The German 1898 Mauser, they put a clip of 8 or 10 bullets in there. They can fire off 1.5 clips, sometimes 2 clips in 60 seconds. The British did the same thing with their Lee Enfields. And, when they're massed shoulder to shoulder, you can't miss. You just fire, reload, fire, and reload. All right, so the Germans are pushed back. The Germans occupy the high ground, establish good defensive positions, and everybody begins to dig in. One thing that they both try to do is to flank the other one. They're both moving north, and one of the first battles is the Battle of Ypres. The Germans try to break through to the Channel port. The Allies hold with 50,000 British, 50,000 French, and 150,000 casualties. Now, the British had landed with an expeditionary, the whole British Army, incidentally, in 1914, regular army is 250,000 men, of which they have about 150,000 in England. The rest is stationed in the colonies. But British land about 100,000 men on the continent, but the losses are so severe that by December 1914, those guys are essentially dead. The British mobilize a territorial army for replacement, but the British don't have a draft. It's not until 1915, 1916 that they institute a draft. So the British don't have a very big army. This is one of the reasons why the Kaiser is dismissive of the British. He said if the British declare war, we'll send some policemen up to northern France to arrest them. And it was pointed out that the British had dreadnoughts, and the Kaiser said, well, dreadnoughts don't have wheels. Bad mistake. All right, so 1914, October, the first battle of Ypres. November, Turkey joins the Central Powers. Why does Turkey join the Central Powers? Because Turkey is at odds with Russia, and Russia has been seizing Turkish land along the in the Balkans and along their common border, and Turkey wants that land back. Also, the Turks are irritated at the British. The Turks have paid the British to build 2 new dreadnoughts for them, and those dreadnoughts are actually finished by July 1914. They've been bought and paid for. The Turks have sailors in England ready to take control of those ships, and as war starts looming, the first Sea Lord, man by the name of Winston Churchill, decides that we're not going to give these ships to the Turks. We're going to seize them and put them in the British fleet for better use in the British fleet. So they seize the ships. The Turks are outraged over this. Now Churchill says, don't worry about it. We'll pay so much rent for these ships every day, and after the end of the war, we'll give them back to you. So the Turks are absolutely outraged. Now the Germans have a dreadnought and a battle cruiser in the actually it was a battle cruiser and a light cruiser in the Mediterranean, the Goeben and the Breslau. And they're being chased all over the Mediterranean by the British fleet, but they manage to elude the British fleet, and they get to Constantinople, Istanbul. And when they get to Istanbul, They are immediately sold to the Turks, and they become part of the Turkish Navy. Of course, the sailors are still German, and the sailors just simply change uniforms and put a fez on their hats. So this really irritates the British. Essentially, Turkey has an alliance with Germany, but it's not until November that becomes obvious, and war is declared between Turkey and Russia, and then Turkey, France, and Great Britain. All right. From November 1914 to the spring of 1917, you have stalemate. Now, the slide says over 500,000 men are killed on the Western Front. That figure is actually inaccurate. It's probably closer to 2 million men on the Western Front. This is the flower of European manhood. The lines will change little, less than 10 miles in either direction. What they did is they dug in a series of trenches, not just one trench, but a front trench, a second trench, a reserve trench, a supply trench. Sometimes they dug in 5 separate trenches covering maybe 3 or 4 miles. In front of each trench they had barbed wire, and very difficult to penetrate. You could charge. The whole area was covered with machine guns, it was covered with rifles, it was covered with heavy artillery. Most of the casualties in the war incidentally are going to come from heavy artillery. The amount of shells they fired was absolutely mind-boggling. At the Battle of the Somme, for example, the British will fire 1 million shells at the Germans over a period of 1 week before they will assault the German lines. They were so confident in the ability of these shells to destroy the German lines. When the British went over the top, they were told, you don't even need rifles, you'll just walk over and all the Germans will be dead. Well, the shells might have driven the Germans crazy, but they weren't dead. As soon as the shelling stopped, the Germans came out of the trenches, the British went up and started marching toward the German lines. Most of them didn't get more than 100 or 200 yards out of their own trenches before they were killed. The British will lose 20,000 dead on the first day of the Somme in June of 1914. But this trench system is virtually impossible. If you assault the trenches, you're going to get a lot of men killed. That's just the way it is. You cannot break the trenches. Now, they tried a lot of different ways to do it. They tried the flanking operation. That didn't work. They tried personal armor, like the medieval knights. They tried different machinery, but nothing seemed to work. It's only in 1916 that they come up with something called the land tank. This is Churchill's opinion, Churchill's idea. In other words, let's have an armored machine with guns. It's totally armored. And this is going to evolve into the tank. And by 1917, the British will be using tanks. And the tank and the airplane will become breakthrough weapons. Not so much in the First World War, but in the next World War. But, the lines virtually do not change. The trenches are 10 to 12 feet deep, probably 10 to 12 feet wide, and virtually impenetrable. Incidentally, the Germans built the first trenches, the best trenches. If you've ever seen the movie Paths of Glory, you'll see a fine example of trench, what a real World War I trench was like. Those trenches, the film was done in Germany, and those trenches were built by the same German engineers who built the trenches in 1914 and 1915. Now this trench looks very nice, but mostly the trenches were soggy, they're wet, they had mud in them, they had rats in them, they had lice in them. It wasn't very nice living in a trench. And you've all heard the term trench foot? That comes from this period of time. Imagine getting in these trenches and having your feet wet for 2 or 3 weeks and cold. Okay. All right. Now the Germans are very inventive. In 1915, they had a fine chemical industry, and they introduced gas. The first gas was chlorine gas. They used this on the Eastern Front at first, and they killed thousands of Russians. The Russians don't know what it is. The Russians make a report to the British and the French, but the British and French don't believe it. They used it in the West in April and May of 1915, the Second Battle of Ypres. Now, they use the gas. The problem with gas is you fire the gas off and you can't control which way it's going to go. Could blow back on you.
Depends on how the wind is.
But when they use the gas, they're not really prepared to take advantage of it. A wide line opens up in the British and the French lines there, but the Germans don't have the reserves and don't take advantage of it. Before they realized the importance of gas, the British and the French have gas masks, and they've also developed their own gas. The Germans will come up with different types of gas too. Chlorine was the first one they used. All right. Now, how are you going to break the stalemate? Well, Winston Churchill, first Sea Lord of the Admiralty, this is a man with, how shall I say, a fertile mind. He says, we're going to flank them. We're going to flank them by seizing the straits, seizing Constantinople. We're going to seize this area. Now, in order to seize Constantinople, you have to seize this area, the Dardanelles Straits. So an amphibious expedition is mounted. First they send the Navy in, British and French pre-dreadnoughts and ships in to see if they can shell the Turkish forts and force a passage to Constantinople. I say Constantinople, it's really Istanbul. These ships go in and they hit mines, and the British lose 2 pre-dreadnought battleships, the French lose 1. That doesn't work. So then they send the army, and the army consists mainly of Australian and New Zealand troops. They land the army at a place called Gallipoli along the shore. Not a good place to land an army. The beach is only 50 yards or so wide. Then you have bluffs. You have to climb. At the top of the bluffs are the Turks. So they land the army in February of 1915. They get about 200,000 men ashore. What do the British and the Australians, New Zealanders do when they get ashore? Well, they congratulate themselves. They sit down, they fire up their cooking materials, and they brew up a cup of tea. What are the Turks doing? The Turks are up top running away because they don't have any ammunition, so they take off. On their run to the rear, they come across a Turkish colonel by the name of Mustafa Kemal. Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, turns these guys around and says, you can't run away, the enemy's over there. And they say, look, we don't have any ammunition. Kemal says, I don't care if you don't have any ammunition. Do you have bayonets? Yes, fix your bayonets and charge. He says, I don't order you to fight, I order you to die. So the Turks go back and they hold the British and the French, and then we have for 8 or 9 months stalemate in this area. Thousands are going to die. The British will launch repeated attacks on the Turkish positions, and they will fail. This event is known as Anzac Day in Australia and New Zealand. I think said a lot to and contributed a lot to the eventual decision by Australia and New Zealand to become fully independent states. The soldiers who participated in that had a very high opinion of the British military before. They didn't have a high opinion of the British military afterwards. So this was a disaster. And Churchill bore the blame of it. And eventually he's going to have to resign his position. All right, now the naval warfare. The Kaiser built up the second best navy in the world. Kaiser has about 14 dreadnoughts, about 6 battle cruisers. The problem was the British had 26 dreadnoughts and about 10 battle cruisers. Now, it's one thing to have the second best navy in the world, except when you go to war against somebody that has the first best navy in the world. So the German Navy is going to spend 4 years essentially locked up in port. Going to come out a few times, but mainly at the Battle of Jutland in May 1916. But basically the German Navy is not going to contribute anything to the war. But Germany does have a war-winning weapon. This is a new device called the submarine. How do you use a submarine? They're working it out. You use it to sink commercial shipping, such as the Lusitania, and also to sink a warship if you can get your eyes on a warship. And the Germans will sink British warships during this period of time. The problem is, according to international law, before you sink if you're a man of war, before you sink a commercial ship, you have to give the ship fair warning, you have to let people get off the ship, and you have to make a provision for the ship. Now, if you're a dreadnought, you can do that, that's no problem. But if you're a submarine and you surface, what's going to happen? Well, the commercial ship may have a 3 or 4 inch gun, will open up fire on you, or will try to run you down. And this happens to a number of German submarines. And the German submarines just attack first and ask questions later, and people die. And when the Lusitania goes down in May 1915, over 100 Americans died. Now, the Americans were warned not to sail on the Lusitania. There were ads in the newspaper to sail on the Lusitania anyway. Woodrow Wilson and the American people were outraged, and Wilson forces the Germans to scale back on their submarine attacks. Now, it's a violation of international law. But then again, England has imposed a blockade on Germany, which is a violation of international law because it's blockading not only munitions, it's blockading food to Germany, and that was not supposed to happen. And also, England limits imports to Denmark, to the Netherlands, to Sweden, to Norway. This was an absolute violation of international law. The Germans will protest, and so Wilson will write a series of strong notes to the French and the British, but they don't listen to them at all. May of 1915, Italy comes into the war. Why? Italy wants the Dalmatian coast of Austria-Hungary. Very unfortunate choice. The Italians will lose almost 1 million men in the war. What will they gain? Virtually nothing. Okay. 1915, 1916, Turkey orders the expulsion of the Armenians from Turkish lands in Anatolia. And just south of the Black Sea, they are expelled to the Middle East, to modern Syria. It's estimated that 1.5 million died out of 2 million living in their empire, although the numbers are not certain. Is this genocide? The Armenians say yes, many others say yes. The Turks say no. It's interesting, much of the horror of the Armenian exodus and genocide is documented by a German doctor by the name of Alfred Wegener. The Germans were not supposed to report on what was happening to the Armenians, but Wegener did. Wegener took photographs and he wrote back to Germany and told everyone about this tragedy that was happening. So if you look at photographs of the Armenians during this period of time, mostly they were taken by a German doctor. After the war, Wegener goes back to Germany, and when Hitler comes into power and he introduces his legislation against Germany's Jews, Wegener writes Hitler and says, look, be careful, look what happened to the Armenians. I mean, we don't want anything like this to happen to the Jews. This is leading to genocide. And Hitler doesn't respond to Wegener, but apparently he made a comment to his staff saying, this man's a fool, who remembers the Armenians? Okay, so genocide, poison gas. The great battle, some would say the worst battle, comes here at Verdun. 1916, the war is a stalemate. Falkenhayn, who's head of the German army, knows that he cannot continue. He's got to win the war. So he attacks at a place called Verdun, where there's a salient in the army, in the line into German territory. Now the purpose of the attack is not to take Verdun, it's to draw the French in and to bleed the French army white. Falkenhayn wants to kill 5 French soldiers for every German soldier killed. Now the crown of the Kaiser's family, the Hohenzollern family, is losing prestige during this period of time. So the Kaiser insists he put his son in charge, the Crown Prince of Prussia. Okay, Crown Prince of Prussia's in charge, but either Falkenhayn didn't explain the war plan to him, or the Crown Prince went off on his own. The Crown Prince charges into Verdun, and he practically takes Verdun. And this is celebrated throughout Germany. And this means that the Germans are in Verdun, they're stuck, and the French come into Verdun. So rather than having the French come in and the Germans just simply blast them apart with their artillery, they're both in Verdun. This battle will last from February 1916 till about November 1916. We'll have 800,000 casualties and not accomplish anything. When the French sent their troops into Verdun, the division stayed there only 2 weeks or 3 weeks at the most. then they left. So by the November of 1916, almost every unit of the French army had served at Verdun. Okay, the great naval battle of the wars on May 31st, the Battle of Jutland. This is forced by von Falkenhayn. Von Falkenhayn says, what's the use of these ships? We're not using them in any way against the British. So the German fleet comes out. The aim of the German fleet under their Admiral Hipper and Reinhard Scheer was to trap part of the British fleet. In other words, we're going to chop up the British fleet and even up the odds. Well, the German battlecruiser squadron comes out, the British battlecruiser squadron under Beatty comes out, and they meet each other, and they exchange fire. Hipper is going to retire. He wants to draw the British battlecruisers into an area where the German dreadnoughts are. During that exchange of fire, 2 or 3 British battlecruisers just blow up. And Beatty is said to have remarked, there's something wrong with our bloody ships today. Now, the man who commands the British fleet is a man by the name of Jellicoe. Jellicoe has a unique responsibility, as Churchill said. He's the only man who can lose the war in the afternoon. He has to keep naval supremacy. So he gets criticized for not being more aggressive, but he does exactly what he needs to do. He preserves the integrity of the fleet. Jutland is really a tactical victory for the Germans. They sink more ships than they lose, but it's a strategic victory for the British because the British maintain the blockade. And the German fleet won't come out again. At the end of the war, they try to come out, but there's a mutiny. They don't come out. All right, 1916, the French asked the British to take the offensive north of Verdun at a place called Somme. Douglas Haig, who was commander of the army, is willing to do this. His troops are eager. They're not well trained, but they've got a lot of artillery. They fire 1 million shells. Incidentally, of the 1 million shells they fired, probably 10% were duds. They just landed there, didn't go off. So French farmers and Belgian farmers today, as they plow up the land, they're raising a crop of about 100 tons of shells every year. Now, when you find those shells, you don't pick them up as a souvenir and take them home, put them on the mantelpiece. What you do is you call in the army guys and they collect them because they're very dangerous. The Battle of the Somme, British and French offensive, 420,000 British casualties, 195,000 French casualties, 650,000 German casualties. Look at these numbers. These numbers are absolutely incredible. And remember, what is this war about? Austria wants to teach Serbia a lesson. All right, 1917, Ludendorff, who was now in charge, says, we've got to end this war. We've got to pull out all weapons. So he pushes the Kaiser and the Navy into beginning unrestricted submarine warfare. This is going to bring the United States in the war. Ludendorff is not worried about it because he thinks the war is going to be won before the United States can bring its force to bear. And Russia is beginning to crumble. All right, to make sure that the United States really comes into the war, the German foreign minister sends a telegram to the German legation in Mexico, of which the British pick it up and the British translated, essentially offering Mexico an alliance with Germany, and after the end of the war, Mexico will get back Arizona and New Mexico, part of Texas. Now, the Germans were very nice to the British. When the war began, the British cut all the cables between Europe and America, but they left one cable intact. That's the one that went from Germany to New York through London, because they gave some reason that American personnel in Germany would need to use it. Why did they leave it intact? Because they were tapping it and they were reading all the German diplomatic notes. Germans thought they had an unbreakable code, but not. When this news is released, Wilson blows the stack, and America is going to come into the war. So April 6th, America declares war, mobilizes, sends troops to France under Blackjack Pershing, one of the senior generals in the army. Why does Pershing have the name Blackjack? Because he commanded 2 regiments of African-American troops in the West. Pershing was born in 1860, and he's essentially an Indian fighter. All right, In May, the French army is exhausted. The French army is on the verge of mutiny. In fact, several units of the French army do mutiny. Now, unlike the Russians, they don't turn their rifles on their officers. They simply refuse to go back. They fought enough. They want their officers to know, they want the French government to know that they're citizens, will fight to defend France, but they're not going to attack and throw their lives away uselessly. The Germans do not know about this, and they do not take any offensive operations during this period of time. In March, the government of Nicholas II collapses, and you have a new government come in under Alexander Kerensky. There's a great debate whether or not they should continue the war. Kerensky says we're going to continue the war, and they will launch an offensive in July. The Germans will break up the offensive, and the Russian army will continue to will just disintegrate, absolutely disintegrate. So things are looking pretty good for the Germans. They got Russia out of the war, and they managed to get a guy by the name of Lenin into Russia. The French army is on the verge of mutiny, and things are looking pretty good. November 7th through 16th, the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks come into power. Lenin says, no more war, peace, land, and bread. We're out of this war. So Lenin comes back and he takes Russia out of the war. They begin negotiating a separate peace. January 1918, President Wilson issues his peace plan known as the 14 Points. Now he does this without consultation with the British and the French. Americans like to do this. Such things as the restoration of Belgium, free and open borders between nations, settlement of all territorial disputes. So there are things here that the French like, there are things here that the Germans like, but there are things there that both hate. But he announces this, and no negotiations. This is the peace plan. March, the Germans and the Russians sign a treaty at Brest-Litovsk. This is a very harsh treaty, and for those who criticize Treaty of Versailles is nothing like the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Germans take Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Finland is recognized an independent state. Essentially, the Germans take 250,000 square miles of Russian territory, which wasn't a very smart thing to do, because one thing Germany is short of is troops. Germany doesn't have the divisions needed to assault in the West at this period of time. And when you take all this territory, you have to occupy it. So that means a large portion of the German army is going to be tied down in the East. And this also makes the British and French even more determined to continue. Now, very briefly, this is the first war that's fought in the air. The airplane, first flies in 1903 with the Wright brothers. By 1914, progress in aviation has passed the Europe among the French and the Germans. They're flying very rickety planes. They weren't quite sure what to do with them. They were originally used as scouts, and a French plane and British plane in 1914 saw the turn in the German army in front of Paris, which led to the Battle of the Marne. But as these guys are flying past each other, some guy gets an idea, we'll fly over the enemy trenches, we'll throw out a few grenades, so they do that. And then the next day they're up flying and someone is throwing out grenades, and the next plane comes by with a pistol. So they start shooting at the opposite plane with a pistol. Then the next day somebody goes up and says, okay, you got a pistol, I got a shotgun. And they start shooting with a shotgun. And before you know, they're all mounting machine guns. Now one of the problems was they didn't know where to put the machine gun. At first they put the machine gun in the front of the plane so the pilot could aim, but this had the unfortunate consequence of shooting off the propeller. They tried various ways to correct this. They put blades on the propeller to deflect the bullets, but the Germans and the Dutch come up with something called an interrupter gear, which they would fire through the propellers. So air warfare is going to develop very rapidly. By 1916, you have fighter planes, which are fighting for dominance in the air, strafing trenches, and dropping bombs. By 1917, you're going to have the development of bombers. The Germans will bomb London in 1915, but they will use Zeppelins. But by 1917, 1918, both sides had bombers. All right, the last great German offensive of the war comes in March and July of 1918. This is Ludendorff's idea. Ludendorff now has a numerical superiority in the West. The Americans have not been fully deployed, and he strikes. And in a period of 4 months, he pushes the Americans and the French back. He gets to within 40 miles of Paris. He alarms the French so much that the French government leaves the city of Paris. But the offenses are not really coordinated. Ludendorff simply runs out of Maine. He doesn't have the resources really to continue the war. August 8th is their Schwarztag, the Black Day. The German army is taking heavy losses, and the German troops are surrendering in large numbers. The German troops simply want to get out of the war. All right, August 8th through 11th, the Battle of Amiens. The Allies push the Germans back. The Germans are forced to retreat to the Hindenburg Line. The Kaiser now sees the handwriting on the wall and says, look, we have to come to some sort of understanding. Ludendorff says the war must be ended. The German morale is broken. And also the Allies begin to realize that they can win in 1918 if they keep up the pressure. October 14th, Germany seeks peace based on Wilson's 14 points. The United States says no, Kaiser's got to step down. All right, Kaiser steps down, Germany's declared a republic. Kaiser goes into exile in Holland where he will spend the rest of his life. All right, November 11th, the Germans sign an armistice ending the war. And that's what it is, it's an armistice. And that's celebrated even today, November 11th. It's known as Armistice Day. The casualties of the war, absolutely horrendous. Australia, 58,000 dead. Austria-Hungary, 922,000. Belgium, 102,000. Britain, 658,000. France, almost 1,400,000. Germany, 1,600,000. All right, here's another chart showing the casualties. Treaty of Versailles. This is negotiated among the Americans, the British, the French, and the Italians, although the Italians will later drop out. And Germans aren't part of this. They just negotiated. They come up with their own position. Poland is created independently of Germany and Russia. It's a free state. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania become free states. Austria-Hungary, and Czechoslovakia are created from the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. Serbia and Bosnia are united, that becomes Yugoslavia. Alsace-Lorraine is taken from Germany, given back to France. German Army, Navy are dissolved, and Germany is going to have to pay $33 billion in war damages and accept full responsibility for the war. Now, here you see a map. This is a map of Europe in 1914. This is a map of Europe after 1914. You see the great change. Now let me ask you a question.
Probably a little bit before that time.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Look at both of these maps. Which side won the First World War?
We did.
We did.
Yeah.
How many people think we won the First World War?
Well,
How
the
many people
sense
think
we
the British and the
lost.
French won the First World War? The Germans won the First World War. Now, before you think I'm bonkers, I'm not bonkers. Germany remains intact. Germany loses some territory in the east to Prussia, to Poland. That's the Polish corridor. They lose Alsace-Lorraine, but Germany essentially remains united. German industry remains intact. The German population remains intact. The German army remains intact. So Germany is still the strongest economic power in Europe, strongest industrial power in Europe, and has potentially the strongest army in Europe.
The Second World War.
Yeah,
Part of it was
you see the Second World War on the rise. Now the French have been devastated. The loss of manpower in France is such that I think the morale of the French army is busted. The British are absolutely disgusted. They don't want to get involved in a war. The Russians have pulled out. Where is the balancing power in Europe? Instead of a strong Russia, a strong Austria-Hungary, a strong France, you now have a weakened France. You have a bunch of small states in Central Europe, and you have a Russia that's not even part of the international state system. All right. After the war, the Treaty of Versailles, it irritates the Germans. They're angry over the treaty. They don't feel it's their fault. They don't like paying the $33 billion, and the German army marches back and tanked, and the German army says, we didn't lose the war. We were stabbed in the back by the politicians and stabbed in the back by the Jews, which is interesting. The German Jewish population was 600,000. The German population was 85 million. About 150,000 Jews served in the German army. About 25 or 30,000 lost their lives in the German army. But Germany didn't lose the war. Germany was stabbed in the back. That's what the Germans say. Now, the two powers that are persona non grata in the international state system are Germany, Weimar Germany, and Soviet Russia. What did Germany and Soviet Russia do in 1922? They signed an agreement. They signed a trade agreement between the two of them. The Rapallo, the Pact of Rapallo. Okay, so what's wrong with signing a trade agreement? But all agreements have secret clauses. One secret clause allows the German army to rearm and re-equip and train in Russia. So from 1922 to 1933, the German army is conducting exercises in Russia, developing tanks, developing airplanes, developing the technology that will be needed for the Second World War. It's only when Hitler comes into power that this cooperation is stopped. And if you want to know why Stalin has the purge trials in the 1930s, is that he doesn't trust his generals. They've been too friendly and too cooperative with the Germans. Of course, they were ordered to do this by Lenin and later Stalin, but that made no difference to Stalin. But I would maintain that it was Germany who won the war. As General Foch said in 1919 when the peace was signed, this is not a peace, this is an armistice that will last only 20 years and the war will start again. He was wrong. He missed it by a month. All right. Why don't you put the light on? I'm available for questions. I have talked longer than I had designed to talk, but we still have a half hour. All right. Yes, Germany won the war. Oh, I got to bring the...
I still say it's rough.
Okay. Who wants to ask any questions or dispute anything that I've said? Yes.
To continue with what Harry said, during World War I, no enemy artillery shell or small arms fire or any kind of destruction was vested on Germany. There were a couple of Zeppelin raids which didn't amount to anything. So essentially when World War I ended, pictures that you see of Europe are Belgium and France with all the destruction. There was no destruction in Germany. The German army turned around, kept all their weapons, all their equipment. They went back, had a big parade down into the London, through the Brandenburg Gate, went back to the armories, put all their equipment back in the army, and went back to business like nothing had ever happened, except because they'd had a lot of casualties.
I have a question.
Yes.
If they had to pay $33 million,
Billion.
in restitution, how did their economy come back?
Well, that's a good question. What they did was they inflated the economy, first of all. The German government didn't have the money to pay for the war, so they just printed marks. And they have runaway inflation. By 1922, you needed something like 4 billion marks to buy a loaf of bread. You had to be paid twice a day. So you could go and you take a wheelbarrow full of money. But where did they get the money from? They borrowed the money from the United States. And they paid the money to Britain and France, who took the money that they owed to the United States and paid it back to the United States. So the Germans paid virtually nothing. All the money in war reparations came from the United States. It went to Britain and France, who paid the United States back. So the United States was left holding the bill for the war. Now, isn't that logical? Okay. Yes.
I noticed in the two maps that Romania about doubled in size.
Yes.
What's the explanation for that?
Romania came in on the side of the Allies, and the price for Romania coming in was Transylvania. Romania had lost Transylvania in one of the Balkan Wars, so yeah, Romania doubles in size. Now these these countries, Romania and Hungary, for example, don't like each other. And during the Second World War, the Romanians and the Hungarians were allies of Hitler. They were at Stalingrad. And the Romanians and Hungarians were on the left wing of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. But Paulus, who was the German commander, had to put the Italians in between them. Because if he didn't put the Italians in between them, they would start shooting at each other. But they got Transylvania. That was their price. They all wanted prices. Italy wanted something. Greece wanted something. They all wanted territory. One thing you'll notice is the boundaries in Europe don't remain static. They change. Even today, now, they're changed. There's nothing absolutely sacred about boundaries. That's why when you hear the story of the Middle East, you can't change boundaries. Of course you can change boundaries. They change all the time. They change throughout history. All right, so Romania gets Transylvania. Why anyone would want Transylvania, I don't know. Except they could get the whole of Dracula. All right. Who else? Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the population levels of each country before and after the war?
Well, the population level of France is 45 million, England about 45 million, Germany 85 million, Austria-Hungary 45, 50 million, Russia 130 million. The one that's impacted the most is France. The French lose about 1.5 million killed, maybe 2 million seriously wounded. Now, you think about a population of 45 million, 22 million are male. Assuming you only enlist people in the Army that are 18 to 30, although they would go up much beyond that, you're talking about a pool of about 6 to 8 million people. You kill 1.5 million, 2 million wounded. That means that there are a lot of women who are going to lose their husbands. There are a lot of women who are not going to get married. This has a ripple effect throughout these societies. And it means that in the 1930s, when the Germans are rearming and building up their army, the French want to build up their army, but they simply do not have the pool of young men to draft in the army because they were not born during the years 1914 to 1918 or thereafter. So what the French have to do is to increase the term of service from 2 years to 3 years. The British were better able to handle it because a lot of those casualties came from India, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. So the impact was heavy on England, but not that heavy. The Russians suffered tremendously, but the Russians have a larger population. They bounce back, and Austria-Hungary just disappears, and they're not going to be a factor. But the one that suffered the most, apparently suffered the most, was really France. Germany suffered, but 85 million. They came back very rapidly. And the German army was the finest in Europe during this period of time. It remained the finest throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. And it was an experienced army. Someone else? Yes?
So what was the incentive for Germany wanting to go to start the Second World War? Because they fared fairly well. I mean, in a way better than some of the other countries. What was their incentive?
Revenge. Wanted to erase the stain of Versailles. Also, Hitler wanted to create a greater German Reich. Some people are simply going to be murdered. He wants a greater German state, a powerful German state, a state that's the equal of Great Britain and the United States and Russia. This is the First World War and the Second World War, really flip sides of the same war. And that's a war in which Germany is attempting to establish its dominance in Europe. Yes?
You briefly talked about, at the very beginning, about the breakup of how the British and French redrew the lines in the Middle East. If the Ottoman Empire either had not joined the Germans and Austria, and had not fallen after the war, how do you see, what, speculative I realize, but...
Middle East would have been totally different. You wouldn't have had all the conflict that you have in the Middle East today. Would the, the Ottoman Empire eventually disintegrated and various states come about? I don't know. It was a caliphate, and basically people were pretty much satisfied with the caliphate. ISIS is trying to reestablish the caliphate, but it was a pretty tranquil area before 1914. after 1918, 1919 was anything but tranquil, and today it is an absolute cauldron of conflict. That was one of the real bad impacts of the war, was the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. Because the British went in, and the British nourished that Arab revolt. They said, you join us, you're going to get freedom. At the same time, they had signed a treaty with France called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which they divided up the Arab lands and were going to make them all colonies. Guess what? They lied. Yes, Al.
Yeah, one more question.
One more question.
And if you have any others, you can come up and talk here.
Any more questions?
A double question?
Couple questions. I'll give you a single answer.
The social movement, towards socialism and
Yes.
down of aristocracy and all that, was that a result of World War I, or was that happening anyway?
No, that was very prominent before the war. And one of the reasons why the Germans, for example, wanted to go to war was that they were afraid of the socialists. They wanted to rally the socialists. Jean Jaurès, who was a French socialist leader, preached that the working men of Europe should not participate in this war. And he held an international congress in Basel, Switzerland, in late July, trying to rally the socialists of Europe. But when he got back to Paris, he was assassinated. So socialism was very powerful, and it will remain powerful after the war, especially in France and especially in England. These countries will move to the left. And even in Germany, the largest party is going to be the Socialist Party in Germany. So it's very important. In fact, when Hitler forms his party, he calls it the National German Socialist Workers' Party. National Party, Party of Germany, pure Germans, socialists, applied to the working class. But socialism was important before the war, and it was going to become even more important after the war. The socialists believed that they should not join the war. They did join the war. Lenin preached that they not join the war. They joined the war. They were citizens first and socialists second.
Then I just wondered how Belgium fared.
Belgium had its territory restored, and it would rebuild, and once again become a sovereign, independent, neutral state, only to have its territory violated again by the Germans in 1940 and have the whole thing repeat itself. Belgium suffered in the war. The Germans came in, and the Germans were shooting citizens left and right. They were, impressing Belgian citizens, taking them off to work in Germany. I would say if you study the way the Germans conducted themselves in the war, of course, the Russians weren't much better. You can see all the strains of the German army in Russia in the Second World War. It's all there. Taking of hostages, the mass shootings of people, deportations. It's all there. Not as to the extreme that you have in 1940. 45, but it's all there. It's not to say that the Allies were great. The Russians were terrible. The Russians would come in and absolutely level a village and kill everybody. The Russians drove all the Jews out of the Jewish Pale and drove them into the interior of Russia. They were Russian citizens, but they did that anyway. The Austrians would do the same thing. The Austrians would murder thousands of Serbs. The Serbs weren't in Serbia. The Serbs were in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Technically, they were Serbians. They were Austrian citizens. So they all did that. The war just unleashed hell on Europe.
Thank you very much, Harry.
All right. The test will be next week.